Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Sandler. I'm the retired guy, and it's about as dressed up as I've been for 9 months, so kind of special morning for me. Thank you all for making your way over here. These concurrent sessions just fly by, 45 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep this short. Bruce Lee says that if you spend too much time talking about something, you'll never get it done, and those of you who work in libraries probably understand the truth of that. So I really want to get out of the way and allow our four very insightful and experienced panelists to share their thoughts with you over the next 40 plus minutes. And I'll just say briefly, and it's like Kellyanne Conway telling me to use a teleprompter here, I'll just say that our interest this morning is to think out loud about some of the established and emerging business models for digitizing archival content, and that could be incunabula, can be oral histories or postcards or back files of Mad Magazine or whatever. So what we'd like to do is unpack some of the underlying issues of cost in those different models, and also value in terms of scholarly utility and accessibility. And with that vague lead-in, let me just say how happy I am to be joined this morning by by four very bright people. Stephen Rhind-Tutt, who's founder and president of Alexander Street Press, recently acquired by ProQuest. I don't know if that's in the brand yet or not. And Rachel Frick, who's executive director of the OCLC Research Library Partnership, and formerly was business director at the Digital Public Library of America. Rebecca Welzenbach, who's director of strategic integration and partnerships for University of Michigan Publishing Services, and Peggy Glahn, the program director at Reveal Digital. And I actually have just a lot of history with these folks and a lot of very laudatory things to say about each of them. But I'm just not going to say any of that so that you all get the benefit to see and hear for yourselves how good they can be. So with that, I'm going to ask Stephen to come on up first, and then we'll work our way through, and we're hoping to leave some time for discussion at the end. So we'll be watching the clock. Thank you again for coming.
Great, so I have 6 minutes, so I think I've got to be very speedy. In 6 minutes, there's not a great deal of time to talk through things. So what I thought I'd talk to is really the axis around what content is, how content is paid for, and how open content feeds into that. So, I tried down arrow. Oh, there we go. Houston, we have a problem. What I'm going to do? It's not advancing at all. Oh, there we go. All right. Excellent. So my perspective comes from publishing the kind of Alexander Street collections that I hope most of you are familiar with. I just want to stress that up front. This is not a journal approach or a monographic approach. What I notice is that there's a great deal of debate around the schism of whether content should be made openly available to all, or whether content should be behind a paywall, with publishers typically saying that the content should be behind a paywall, and open access advocates saying it should be free. And my contention today is that we have to do both. Faculty need content, whether it costs or whether it's open. They need to have a unified interface. I'm trying to make this plea not on a philosophical basis, because I think there's so much discourse around what in effect are religious schisms about whether information should be free or not. My contention is that we've got lots of examples in the world at large where content has been made open and has been very, very successful for the businesses concerned. Salesforce, OpenTable.com, Google, all of these businesses have made enormous profits and money as a consequence of embracing open. And I believe we can do the same in the publishing world. The reason for this is, as you see up here, there's been a dramatic evolution of publisher costs. So in 1990, we had a lot of residue print material costs. In fact, what's happened now is for small websites, sales and marketing and small publishers, sales and marketing has become a very large cost. But if you're able to achieve web scale, by which I mean really substantive use, then actually the sales and marketing costs diminish because people are naturally introduced to your content. That happens if you make your content open. So if I take a classic open business model, what you do is you build a community around your content. You determine how you fit within a larger internet ecosystem, and you empower your community to create. So let's take Google Maps as an example. Google initially makes something that has always been charged for, maps, free. A community emerges that starts to use those maps. They realize that that internet ecosystem will allow yellow pages and taxi services and Uber to layer services above. And they then create APIs that allow people to use their maps. So the net result is something that's very open, that has actually been able to drive a lot of revenue for publishers, in this case for Google. So Alexander Street has an initiative like this, where what we're trying to do, and you'll bear with me, future presenters will have, I hope, the same problem that I've got here, which is this is really not actually showing me. I can try that. Let's try that. So the Open Music Library is an initiative Alexander Street started about 9 months ago. And the idea was to build a very large open discovery layer across scores, performances of music, and other materials. We chose music, frankly, because Google does a very poor job with it. And we also chose it because many libraries have scores collections that are really lost. People can't find them. So this not only indexes content that's freely available on the web, it also indexes for fee content that Alexander Street charges for. And the idea, the question that we were wrestling with, can we actually drive enough traffic? Can we actually create enough of a community around the shared content to really reduce our marketing costs? So we've partnered with 6 national libraries, as you see listed here. The usage has been growing rapidly, and we have about 20% repeat visits. The intent here is exactly as with Google Maps. We want for Alexander Street, we will provide the investment and the infrastructure to actually deliver the Open Music Library. For faculty, we let them actually post materials. We actually let them put scores and other materials they find up for value. For other rights holders, we actually deliver them traffic. And for libraries and archives, we deliver them traffic too and allow their materials to be contextualized. So, for example, if you think of a score of Berlioz at the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, that score, when somebody comes across it, is typically uncontextualized. By going back into the Open Music Library, we can contextualize it for you. We can show you who Berlioz was, and we can lead you to all the other materials that are pertinent to the study of Berlioz or that score. So the idea overall is that what you'll be able to do here is create a network of links. Now, as far as the actual traffic is concerned, this graphic represents the rate of growth, as you can see, since March. We're growing about 30% a month. About 20% of the users are repeat, which would indicate they're actually finding practical value. And on current projections, we think the amount of paid usage that this will generate for us is about equivalent to the marketing cost that we would otherwise have incurred to promote the site. So our hope is that over the next year or so, we'll actually be in a position to provide this magnificent open service, let the open service grow in leaps and bounds, delivering more traffic to those who are open and free, but at the same time, getting revenue from those who are actually for fee. With that, I'm going to pull to a close.
Excellent. You made my arguments great. I use your slides as a narrative. No, all joking aside, I think Stephen's slides around the open content. I'm actually going to, you thought I was joking, I was going to use your slides, but I am. I love this model, but really it was this slide. Open business models. Building the community around your content, determine how you fit within a larger internet ecosystem and cultivate those connections and empower your community to create. I love this because I feel like this describes what librarians do, or the mission of librarianship, because, you know, the mission, I'm looking at David Lankus because I think the mission of new librarianship is facilitating those conversations and the creation of new knowledge. So if that's a core of what libraries do, what librarians do, we basically are set up as an open business model. So how do we flip that when we think about the collections we create and the collections we publish in a library? So yes, I am now going to go to my slides. Where are they? File. See, we should have all open. Is it this one? There I am. Sorry guys, I only have 2, so it's really not gonna be much. So I'm always accused of having an obscure slide with a picture and some words on it. So when we think about libraries and our business model around our digital collections and the collections we publish and how do we fund this work, it really actually goes to the very basic on how we do the work, how we actually publish these digital collections. So for me, it's how do we hard code sustainability so that these collections can be maintained and brought into the ecosystem from the very beginning. How do we do this? We got to think about business models beyond the hard money and the hard dollar transaction fee. When we look back at Stephen's model and he saw what Alexander Street Press was investing in and then who was paying for those subscriptions, how do we recast that and say we're actually paying ourselves? You know what your investor tells you, you know, pay yourself first and invest in your retirement fund and then do the other things. That's how we have to think about library created, library published collections and how we have this open business model. You know, people might pay for those particular things, but how are they paying for it? And I think for us, wouldn't you rather invest in your community as a librarian, and how do we get this into the ecosystem, as opposed to having to do that, you're paying up front as opposed to paying when the product is developed at the end. So going to, you know, the things about developing a community, getting hooked into the ecosystem, there's things that we do when we publish digital collections that feed into that sustainability piece of being part of the ecosystem. One of them is data quality. I am known for saying standards are like toothbrushes. Everybody agrees they're a good idea, but nobody wants to use anybody else's. That holds true definitely through data associated to the description of bibliographic description, access and use rights, et cetera, around digital collections. I don't care what standard you use, just be consistent. Because at DPLA, one of the biggest cost and drain of resources was when we aggregated metadata from all of our partners, people would inconsistently apply standards, so we would have to do data transformations, and sometimes it would take 3 days or 4 days to actually integrate metadata into that larger aggregation. That's a soft dollar cost, that's a resource cost, that's a salary cost, and that was something we really tried to think about. How do we reduce those soft dollar costs so we don't have to think about how do we pay for somebody's salary to do this work if we can reduce the number of hours? So that's something we would go back to our partners. How can you consistently apply data so that the cost of aggregating that data is less? The other thing that feeds into the sustainability of these digital collections, how well does that digital collection play when it's outside of its home environment? Does that collection actually have meaning if it's put into a big pile like DPLA? There's a really great article about this, about metadata as an interface by Jennifer Schaffner. It was a research report published, I want to say, in 2008 by OCLC. But to think about this in aggregation, Corey Harper just published an article a few months back in the Code for Lib Journal, and he was analyzing the DPLA data. And there's to show what metadata performed well in aggregation, and therefore those objects were found, that collection was recognized for scholarship, and therefore use use equals sustainability in the large scale of library-produced projects. So when you're applying metadata, how you're making sure that it can be interpreted coherently when it's outside of its home context. How do you apply enough? You know, what fields are the best ones to invest your time in? So once again, it's people resources, and that local expertise applied to that collection will influence use when it's moved outside of its local context. That will increase use, therefore sustainability. The other part is, like I said, extreme sharing. How do you make sure your stuff can live outside of that home context? Once again, I think Stephen's slide was good. He has all those contributing national libraries pushing those digital collections into that open music library. The same concept is with DPLA. How can you make sure that your stuff lives outside? You know, how can you communicate consistently in a machine actionable way what people can and cannot do with those digital assets? And I point to rightstatements.org as a tool to employ there. How can people access and have a consistent user experience when viewing images? Or is your library using something like IIIF, which is an emerging standard? How is your collection being interpreted as data, as a researcher asset? How can somebody come in and do computational analysis on a collection you've digitized when we think about digital humanities research? What are your APIs? How are you facilitating that collection moving outside of that library curated experience? A really great conversation to look at was one that was just happened at the Library of Congress. It was about 2 months ago. There's a link there. And they explored collections as data. That is a big thing. Once again, the more your collection is used, the more your collection can move into the information ecology, the more it will live and last longer. And then, of course, measuring use. At DPLA, we were trying to negotiate agreements to move collections that were represented by the partners in the DPLA environment, curate them into maybe like, we did primary source sets, we had these great curriculum tools, but we were trying to negotiate and have those curriculum tools and those sets to live in different environments, like at PBS Learning Media, at what we called Common Lit. So, but the thing that we always try to negotiate with these third-party platforms is, can they give us metrics so that we can then turn around and report and say, not only we can say how your material was accessed, used, downloaded, viewed at the DPLA environment, but this is how many times it was used over at PBS Learning Media. This is how many times, how many classrooms it showed up through Common Lit. This is how many times that we had retweets on Twitter. It's not just downloads and views, but it's also social media impressions. Really making the argument, once again, for people to participate in things like Open Music Library. I was going to call back to Steve and say, like, what kind of assessment and measurement do you report back to these national libraries so that they can justify the cost of what it takes to contribute to these larger initiatives? So you're making the case for the contribution and for open resources. Because I was kind of elbowing Steve in the beginning. I was like, you have fee versus open. And open isn't free. You just pay at a different part in the process for open. And I feel like for us as librarians and as library publishers of content, it's really important for us as a profession, as a reflection of our ethics, to really invest in the materials we own and have them as part of the information ecology. So going back to measuring and use, this link once again, it's called Getting Found. It's like, thinking about search engine optimization, thinking about those metric tools that we use so that we can make the argument back to our directors, back to the people that pay the bills, why it's important to participate. And even though the investment is upfront, it might keep us from having to subscribe to that same resource from a publisher later on. It's just where you pay at the part of the system and in the stream. So that's pretty much all I had to say. So I'm going to hand off to the next.
Okay, next transition. Let's see how this goes. I'm going to really, well, I'm going to confuse things because mine is just PDF. So we heard a bit from Stephen about how commercial publishers can think about sustainably making collections open, and we heard a bit from Rachel about how library programs can think about ensuring that their digitization projects are sustainable. And what I'd like to talk to you now is about a use case, a particular instance of a partnership between libraries and a commercial publisher that started at the University of Michigan Library, thanks to Mark, many, many years ago, I think all the way back to the year 2000 or thereabouts. And I'd like to sort of reflect on some of the things that I think made this partnership successful and other ways that it was challenging in order to start to think about how these kinds of models and relationships can be replicated, ideally. So the project that I'm speaking about is the Text Creation Partnership, and this was an initiative, again, started at the University of Michigan Library with involvement from the University of Oxford. And the goal was to get lots of libraries, more than 150, to all share the cost of transcribing and marking up in XML the full text of many, many, many thousands of early printed books that had already been digitized by companies like ProQuest, Gale, and Redex. But the most successful and the largest effort of these was the partnership with ProQuest on Early English Books Online. So this is EBO TCP for short, Early English Books Online Text Creation Partnership. The title of our panel is The Right Stuff at the Right Cost for the Right Reasons. So I'm going to try to follow that structure and talk about each of those three things. So the right stuff. In the case of EBO, the selection of the product was really key and central to the success of this partnership, I think. In this case, we were starting with a product that both sides of the equation were already deeply invested in. The Early English Books microfilm series had been around for a long time. Now it was just re-emerging in digital form as Early English Books Online. The earliest reviews of EBO reflect, they're describing how it works and what the problems are, and people are just having their minds blown by having all of these thousands of books available online. But it immediately comes to light that the full text is not searchable. And it's amazing how that shift to digital suddenly made people think that it should be. That was never there before, but now suddenly people wanted it. So how to create it? The timing was such that automatic creation of the full text for these books just wouldn't work. Actually, this still isn't possible. OCR is not good enough to interpret the black letter text and the mixed quality digitized microfilm that makes up the EBO collection. And so the idea was that to get accurate, usable full text, it would have to be all keyed from scratch and marked up. But this was really expensive, way too expensive to do. And so what happened was the libraries came together to fund the effort in partnership with ProQuest. They were equally invested in improving the existing product. They needed it to work better on both sides. There was an alignment of technology, what could and couldn't be done, and timing, what the product was expected to do. And the project just wasn't really possible on either side. ProQuest was willing to put in some money, a lot of money in fact, but in the end only about 20% of what it cost to do the work. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. The rest, about 80% of the funds, were raised by libraries. And they came together to do this. I think what really struck me when I was thinking about this is just without these parties coming together, it just wouldn't have happened. It happened, the partnership worked because it had to work. And that is, I think, what set it apart from some other examples that I'll get to in a minute. So at the right cost, how did the business model work? The costs involved in the project were largely the keying and transcribing and then supporting a team of editors at Michigan and Oxford who proofed and reviewed and looked over the markup. There are other costs, travel, administration, outreach, but the bulk of it was the conversion of the text. And like I mentioned, about 20% of this came from ProQuest. They made a commitment to sort of start things off. That was really, really important as kind of seed funding. It allowed the work to get going and to demonstrate that it would work as we were recruiting libraries to join in and contribute funds. But it was a small amount of the total cost of the project. Then more than 150 libraries each contributed, depending on their size and their collections budget. They contributed between $15,000 and $50,000 apiece. That was mostly spread over 5 years in sort of annual installments. And that's where the money came from. What the contributors got out of that was the contributing libraries got immediate access to the texts, and they were co-owners of the texts. And this was really the distinctive quality of this project. They were not licensing them or renting them or buying them. They were co-creators, co-owners of these XML files that were being created. And that was one of the values and selling points of the partnership, why people wanted to be a part of it, is because they were generating something that libraries owned together in common and could use and do new things with, the reuse that Rachel was talking about. The people actually doing the work, in this case, although the funds came from many libraries, the work was consolidated at Michigan and Oxford. And because of this special relationship, we were able to have, extensive, liberal, pretty free use of all of the EBO images that were needed. It couldn't have just been done, we couldn't have just licensed EBO and then quietly on the side gone and transcribed it. It would have violated the terms of service. There needed to be a special partnership that reflected the use needed to be made of the images. And then finally, what did ProQuest get? Well, they got all of this text back at a fraction of the cost that it cost to create it. They incorporated it into the EBO product, and then were able to sell access to that as well. And for a limited window of time, they were exclusively able to sell it. The libraries that participated always had full access to the text, but those who didn't, the so-called worrisome free riders, there was a limited window where they would not be able to get the text unless they bought them again. And then later, they were opened up to everybody. I think this is something that wouldn't work as well now. So much has changed with expectations around open access and open data, but the model worked at the time. And so for the right reasons, this I think is really interesting, and something that really struck me about why this partnership worked well to the extent that it did. There was agreement between the parties that this was important, that it was vital to do to make this product as strong as it could be, and there was agreement about what was going to be created. What we needed was highly accurate digital text, and it needed to be robust and structured enough that it could stand alone, apart from the page images. This was not just for searchability behind the scenes. The text needed to function well enough that you could read them even if you couldn't see the page, and there was agreement about that. But also built into this relationship, there's some sort of cognitive dissonance that everyone just had to kind of be okay with. Many of the libraries who were doing this were doing it deliberately because they're worried about companies like ProQuest sort of owning all of these public domain materials by virtue of having scanned them, having made the investment to scan them and preserve them, but then owning the images as a result. They wanted to kind of resist that by creating a version that they would own. Simultaneously, with the very same product and out of the very same work, ProQuest was creating another product that they could sell. And it was both at the same time. And we all just kind of lived with it. And I think that is something that is really interesting, that willingness to acknowledge that we could work together even when incentives seemed to sort of be in friction with one another. It was a strange thing, but an interesting thing. So this partnership worked really well for this project, but it's been hard to replicate for various reasons. We tried to do some very obvious replications, doing the same thing with 18th century collections online, Evans' Early American Imprints, other large commercial sets of scanned images. And it worked, those relationships were good, but just on a much smaller scale. It didn't take off in the same way. Part of it was that mutual need that I talked about at the beginning. Echo, for example, 18th century collections online already had searchable full text that had been generated by optical character recognition. It wasn't as accurate as what would have been created by rekeying, but because the search function was there, the need was not being driven by users, by librarians. It wasn't as, the motivation wasn't there. It wasn't seen as immediately necessary to replace. Likewise, because they already had their own set of full text, there was not sort of willingness to take back the XML files that we created and figure out how to squish them into their system, whereas ProQuest had no text at all, so they were very willing to build their system to incorporate our text. So simply replicating the sort of work and the product with a different company, that didn't work so well. It just wasn't as beneficial for everybody. It didn't quite flourish in the same way. So I'm trying to think about what aspects of this are replicable, and I think it's not so much the particular task or the particular project. I think it's about incentives and need, about finding a collection, a project where both the publisher and whoever, the library, the owner, the creator, whoever the other side of the equation is, perhaps are already invested in something, already recognize its value and want to make it better together. Something where they actually can't work without the other, because if you can work out without the other, you will. It's easier. It's a lot less complicated. You don't have to do all these extra sort of arrangements. So it has to be really driven by the need, I think, that it can't be done without cooperation. And there has to be some sort of willingness to understand that you won't always see eye to eye on everything. You won't want the exact same things, but that is okay. And that you can live with that because you're both getting what you need out of it. So that's sort of my perspective on this one particular project, but our struggles with making it work sort of at scale or moving it from model to model. So I'm eager now to hear what Peggy has to say about replication.
You set me up beautifully, thank you. And I think I'm not going to mess with technology. I hope you don't mind if there aren't any slides here. There wasn't much on them anyway, just more for you not to look at me, which I would rather have, but we'll go with this. When we were talking about preparing this panel, Mark had said I was going to be the anchor, and I'm really hoping that I won't be sort of dragging this down, but instead we'll be tying together some of the strands that have been spoken about here. So what I would hope to do is talk about how Reveal Digital has taken some of these challenges you guys have talked about and some of the hopes that you have talked about to create a sustainable open access model that incorporates these some commercial publishing ideals too. So I'll work from my notes. I hope you don't mind my page turning here. I'm going to start by setting the stage with EBO again. And you had talked about this conflict that has existed out there about a private company owning this content. John Overholt, in one of his well-read blogs in 2015, talked about this issue, and here's what he said. He said, it is entirely within the power of the libraries of Great Britain and the U.S. to make this invaluable resource, EBO, available to everyone in the world without a massive subscription fee. He said, these books are part of our cultural heritage, and it's high time we made them available to everyone. I think EBO, we'll go back to that in a minute, but EBO is a great example of where a commercial publisher created a core, probably one of the most important humanities resources that's out there, and it would not have been done without this commercial publishing model. If you go back and look at a guy named Eugene Power. If you don't know him, he was the founder of UMI, ProQuest, a really fascinating person. If you have a chance to read his autobiography, you should do that. But he was the person behind the creation of early English books, microfilm, from whence most of EBO cometh. And he did this all during the war years. 1938 is when he started this, worked through the war years with multiple libraries in the US and the UK. Now, I don't think that he would have taken on this massive, complex, risk-laden project if there hadn't been some promise that he would have his investment returned plus more to do more projects down the line. So that commercial project, that commercial perspective on this was key to making this resource available. EBO does, as Overholt referred to, contain completely all out of copyright material. And what that means is any library can come along that has this material, digitize it, and make it available to anybody. They can completely replicate EBO and make it available for free, as John Overholt said. But nobody's doing that. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. A couple of strategic reasons come to mind, which are the library's most best position to do this work would be the Bodleian Library, the British Library, Library of Congress, and they all have a very strong commercial partnership with ProQuest, and they don't want to necessarily compete with a strong commercial partner. Secondly, they, like all other libraries, have limited resources, so they don't necessarily want to spend money to create something that's already been created. Those commercial kind of strategic issues aside, if you look beyond EBO and just start to think about what are some of the challenges that face libraries and other sort of institutions that are nonprofit in creating an open access publishing program, beyond those strategic things, there are really 5 things that I think commercial publishers do very well, but that have been a struggle for open access programs, not just projects, but programs overall. One, sustainable funding is a biggie, and without that, you don't have anything else. Collaboration across institutions. If you want to really have an impactful program and have good collections, you need to have many libraries contributing, and managing that process is difficult to do from the inside. Equipment, expertise, and scalability. If you want to set up a large, massive digitization program, you need to have high-end material to do that work with. You have to have the workflow expertise, and managing all of those pieces and parts doesn't come naturally to most individual institutions. Sustaining the effort over time. If we're talking about a program that's going to have an impact, it's going to go across decades, hopefully, and being able to sustain that by one department within an institution is very difficult to do. Making content discoverable. Without that, why are we even bothering with any of this if no one's going to be able to use it? So any of these 5 things can be overcome by an individual institution, but if you look at it in total, you can really see it's a daunting task to have something impactful in the open access community to be ongoing. So what we set out at Reveal Digital to do was to really take the strengths offered by commercial publishing and overcoming those challenges and applying it in an open access environment. So what I'm going to do just with the last few minutes is talk very specifically about what we're doing, how our model works at Reveal Digital. I think it'll probably open more questions than it answers because of the short time. So if any of you see me later and want to get more information, I'll be here through Friday. Grab me. I'd love to talk to you more about it. But to start, Reveal Digital has developed an open access funding model and the means to define, create, and promote digitized special collections. So as Stephen was saying, this is not about books, this is not about journals. This model is strictly about collections, primary source material that comes from libraries. The model is based on the concept, like EBO TCP was, of libraries investing in a fund. The fund itself has a thematic overview. So in the case of Reveal Digital, we're looking at a fund that has a theme of civil society in the 20th century. So any collection that is created out of this fund would align with that theme. We work together with libraries to develop project ideas that align with that theme, and we use fairly sophisticated cost models that come out of commercial publishing to think about the cost not just of digitizing, but the whole program of having an open access publishing program. So that's everything from clearing copyright to sourcing material to digitizing the material and then putting it on a platform and doing all of the outreach that's associated with that. Libraries who invest in this fund are not just putting their money in and walking away and hoping something good happens. They are actually driving the strategy of the organization through their participation on an executive committee and then driving the kind of the tactical decisions that are made about what projects move forward by participating in the editorial board. So we're on number 4 of 10. We're getting there, close to the end here. So we manage the work required. What Reveal Digital does to bring to the table here is to manage all of these processes. We manage the boards and the decisions that are made. The projects that are decided to move forward, we're the nuts and bolts of making that happen. So we're outside of the group and we can provide a lot of leadership and direction and keeping things moving as a result of that. Like commercial publishers, the end result, we hope, will be a central location where people will naturally come to find content around this theme. A publisher like Alexander Street is known to have great music content, so people will naturally go there to discover that kind of content. So if we're creating that kind of a space where people know to find this kind of material, it just helps to surface and make it more available, more discoverable to scholars. Libraries under this model are the owners of the material. So when we clear copyright and digitize collections, we clear copyright to use on our platform, but we also clear the copyright for the libraries to have the material under their control. They can do with it whatever they wish. So they are ultimately the owners of the material. The work of building, so this is more of the soft work of building awareness of what we're doing, trying to persuade libraries to participate in it, and then when we have these collections to drive awareness that they're there, that's a big chunk of what we do and where we spend our energies. So in the end, there are 3 benefits that we think most likely come to mind for this for libraries. You may be thinking of some other things that you've keyed on as I've been talking, but these are the big 3 we think. First, our model provides a cost-effective way for libraries to participate in a truly impactful open access program. Not just a project, but a program that will be ongoing for many years. Reveal Digital enables libraries to, through this model, raise awareness and utility of their gems, the things that are in their collections that make libraries unique and valuable in their own communities. And finally, the model puts investing libraries in charge of the publishing program so that it will align with the needs of your own communities. In the end, our goal then is to help more libraries make more content available to more researchers through an approach, a model that incorporates the sophistication of commercial publishing while staying true to our open access ideals. So with that, Mark, I turn it over to you.
Oh yeah, it's on. So first, on behalf of you all, I'll just say thank you all for all that you said and all that you didn't say, to leave time for a few minutes of questions and discussion and interaction. And I think we have 7 minutes maybe for that. Or does anyone know when this is scheduled to end? Is 20 after? 25 after? Nobody knows? Good. Okay. So let me start off with one question, and then we'll get at least one in from you all. But when I think of special collections, I live in a town of about 4,000, 5,000 people. We have a public library. They have a clipping file on the history of the town, that has been built, that they've been collecting probably for 120 years or something. And if they decided they want to digitize this, it's, a real labor of love. They're really committed to this. No one else in the world cares, but, this is something that's special for them. So I'm wondering if you could talk for a minute, and some of these words came up, of course, in your presentations, words like scalability and all of those administrative costs. But could you say something about the sort of labor of love approach? This is our content, and we love it, and we can curate it and do it to the standards that are appropriate, as opposed to more scalable, quote-unquote industrial approaches to digitization. And I would say overall for maintaining those collections over time and making them broadly available over time. Could you all just say something about that issue of scale? And who wants it first?
Scale is something working at DPLA we really wanted to talk about, because how do you take that small local collection and how do you make it available? How do you balance that local and global? How do you make that collection make sense and have value to the people the local historical society? How are you telling the story of your small town? But then how can you relate the story of that small town to the story of America, and where does it fit in? Where does that voice come into the chorus and have that shared American experience? So at DPLA, we tried to connect what we call streams to creeks to rivers to oceans. How do we connect that small historical society to that larger, maybe regional public library that does have a digitization program, that does have a geek squad that goes out like at Digital Commonwealth in Massachusetts and does the scanning and then helps them with the preservation architecture. But then how do you build that local environment so you can see that picture and that local story, but then how do you represent that collection into the Massachusetts story? And then how does the Massachusetts story have some context in the DPLA national story? So it's by kind of connecting all those things together, you're also providing a way for support and use to come back down to that local level. So I guess for me it's, when things get used, when things are connected, when things have coherence and conversation and community around them, that's how you build support for that. Whether it's through local donations because somebody found their parents' photograph in a collection that's in Colorado. We've had these stories at DPLA that we were doing a show, I guess, not a show, but a presentation in New Orleans. And most of the transportation and blueprints and foundational documentation about the streetcar system in New Orleans was actually in Minnesota. So it was amazing to tell the New Orleans story from all of these other collections that had those bits and pieces.
Want anything on it?
I just would like to just notice, I think what Rachel's methodology is an excellent one, but There's a diseconomy of scale that I think a lot of us miss. So to do a little collection can actually be very cheap indeed, because it can be a labor of love. And, you know, we've had instantiations of people building reasonably large collections, literally while watching TV at night over a 3 or 4 year period. And actually, it's a pretty nice collection. When you start getting into a middle-sized digitization project, say 50 or 100,000 pages worth, you can again get away with it without too formal systems. But if you start to do collections at, say, 200,000 pages plus, you suddenly start to need an administrator. And when you make a mistake, it's not just a little collection that you have to look through to find out where that mistake is. It's a 2-day process to leaf through stuff. So actually, if you look at the cost structure to produce, very small, pretty cheap, mid-level, somewhat cheap, large, very expensive. And in the back of one's mind, one's like, oh, but surely, you know, when we hit 2 million pages, when we hit 10 million pages, it's going to get cheaper. Actually, when you hit 2 million pages and suddenly a problem emerges, and you don't know which of the 2 million pages that problem is occurred, give you a specific, for example, in microfilm. In microfilm, pages were sometimes missed. Now, that doesn't matter in microfilm, but if a computer's algorithm says to go to the next page, add 1, well, when it adds 1 and there's no next page, the system will just stop working, and there'll be a blank, and you won't understand why. Again, if it's small, that's easy to see, but if it's big, it's complicated. So I'd just be really aware of this non-linearity. You know, many traditional projects in manufacturing get cheaper as they get larger. Not so with digitization.
I'm going to take a little different approach to this question. A woman called me up about 2 years ago. She was a woman who had been a publisher for a title called The Rag from Austin. And she was getting ready for the 50th anniversary of this pretty well-known alternative press from Texas. And she was hoping that she and her organization was going to be able to raise money to digitize their collection. Well, little did she know, we were halfway through digitizing this material. We were working with University of Texas to get all of the hard copy and digitize this material. She was thinking about her project in her own world. And she wasn't seeing how it could be part of something larger. What we hope to do with our model is to kind of create that mindset with libraries, that they do have these gems, these really important things in their special collections, but they don't necessarily have to live alone. And if they live with other people's content, it's that much richer for everyone else. It becomes more of a magnet for people to find it. So if we can create that sort of environment for that kind of dynamic to happen, then we will have done our job, I think. Anything more?
I guess the only thing I would add from this, my very sort of naive response is just use Flickr. You know, if you're a very small place, if you're an individual, it's a very small collection, use a system that already exists, that's affordable, that connects it with people and users, that allows for tagging and, you know, commenting and creating new albums, just that kind of thing. That's in some ways feels unprofessional, but it also could be really effective. So.
Since you were all nice enough to come and you were all nice to be attentive, let me give you at least a shot. Does someone have a question? We have a microphone there for you. A question, a comment, some experience you've had that you want to share? 1, 2, 3. Okay, then I'm going to go back and just riff on one more thing that I guess, well, Stephen certainly started off on this sort of issue of hybridity and commercial folks really trying to leverage open access material. And to some extent, I guess Becky's comments about folks with an open access mindset, acknowledging and recognizing how much content is owned and behind paywalls and trying to integrate that. Is that really, I mean, do you all sense that somehow bringing that content together is where we're heading, and that to some extent those two different, what do you call them, religious sects are actually going to, those lines are going to blur. Was that one of my takeaways here? So.
I absolutely think so. I think commercial publishing has so much to bring open access and vice versa, and that we're all searching for ways that we can cross-pollinate and for the betterment of the community.
Yeah, to me, it's not actually an answerable question, because what commerce will always do is attempt to lay a value on top. Mm-hmm. So, Sanborn maps are black and white. So a lot of them are public domain. Then let's digitize them in color. Mm-hmm. And after they go out in color, if that goes into the public domain, then commercial companies like, let's 3D these things. Mm-hmm. Commerce will always try and add value, and that's a good thing. We should like that.
Yeah, that was something we talked a lot about at DPLA. I think libraries should try to push everything that is in the public domain, that is openly available for use and reuse. How can we make sure that we digitize it and publish it in a way that, one of the biggest users of the DPLA API is EBSCO EDS. They bring it in, they represent the thumbnails, they represent all the partners and their collections in a unified discovery system. And it's like, where are those where can we take that open content that's available, but put it in places and do the mix-up so that people can find the open things without having to pay for. They use those resources, those subscription dollars, for the things that are behind a paywall because of copyright and intellectual property right restrictions. So we have how can we create more knowledge? And then so everybody can be, have the richest collections whatsoever.
Panelists, thank you so much. Audience folks, thank you so much. Katina, our host here, is, of course, one of the most gracious and terrific people on the planet, unless you violate her schedule, in which case she becomes a she-devil. So I'm going to shut off the mic and let you all move on. But thank you all very much.